Email is fine. Email is something more.
Oh, it's set so that you won't block it. That's why it's in the back.
I just don't want to be standing in front of it.
It's okay.
Ooh, how exciting.
Who would you like to introduce you?
Actually, Diane says she's going to be.
Okay. Right there. I think so.
Yes. Probably more comfortable in the pew.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, maybe eventually people will get tired of using those. Can we sing some words together? Why not? That's how I learned to play the piano in so many respects. I know. And it has a hidden. I'm sure. Well, actually, you have to learn to well. That's a good question. Okay, okay. I wonder if it's true for There's room up in the front. You don't have to sit all the way in the back.
Oh, fine, thank you.
Okay. Okay. Diane, I don't know what happened.
Where did she go?
Diane.
I assumed we were going to start, so I started the live stream.
Right, here comes Kathy. The hard part is figuring out their names. Kathy, we have plenty of room up here if you like a comfy chair, a more comfy chair, less wood.
I'll bet it is more comfy.
Yeah. And if you need to stand up or walk around, okay. All right. All right. How is it going? It's there. Yeah. When springtime comes, it'll improve. And John Madden is still here, is he?
Oh, I think so.
Yes. I'm pretty sure he's the. Yes. Mostly East Boston. You're right, it's got a south. You gave Diane the word, right?
She was like that.
Oh, okay. That's fun. Oh, here. Yeah, it seems stencily like. Wow, that's a lot of stenciling though, isn't it?
is.
In the back. No, no.
No, I just said it.
Just like that. But I'm gonna repeat the questions and all the, or the subjects.
Hello, welcome. Sarah Barford is the chairperson of the program. She's out of town, so I'm filling in to introduce Brian. And set up, right. But I do want to say that exits are that way, if in case of something happening. There is a down the stairs and out the door that way, right through that door. But
In case you don't like something I say.
But on the other hand, it is kind of a bottleneck, so, you know, got to go exiting that way in case of an emergency. I want to thank the St. Paul Evangelical Lutheran Church for having us here today. They are letting us use their facility today and no charge to the guild, so thank you, thank you. And I will thank them for all of us. So as I look around the room, when it came to how am I going to introduce Brian? I'm saying, okay, there are people that have known Brian much longer than I have that are in this room. There are people that know him as long as I have, which has been a long time. We won't talk about that. It's been a long time. So I want to say that I'm going to ask everybody's help. Not too much. And you have to follow directions because we don't want to go blurting stuff out. But what we want is you raise your hand when you thought of a word that comes to mind when you think of Brian. Please be polite.
Please be polite.
So everybody just think about it, and then when you raise your hand, I will point to you, and you can say it nice and loud because there's a camera.
Embarrassing.
Oh, this
I knew Sarah.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Wonderful. Okay?
time.
Kind.
Oh, very good.
Patience. Patience.
Learned that.
Very warm and very real. Very warm and very real.
Same thing.
That's okay if you want to go a second time, anyone? Astute. Astute. These are interesting words.
I hope this is the way we,
Talented, yes.
what we feel this is.
Generous. Do I hear anything from the
I plead the fifth.
Very good.
One of a kind.
One of the great. Great sense of humor. Yes. Yep. Any, yes?
Experienced.
Experience. Yes.
This is like a eulogy.
Oh my God.
High standards.
Standards. Yes. Well, you know, no one said teacher, but all those things are important for a teacher to be all of those things that everybody did say, right? And performer, and talented came out, and brilliant came out. But we're going to my work. No one said it, which is interesting, and I'll tell you why, because I'm the only one who gets to say why. Mine is wise. No, add anything to that. Just wise, very wise, if I were going to have two words. And I'm going to tell you why, because during my time as president, which is 2 years ago now, whenever there was a question about something, we weren't sure how to handle something, and I can't tell you how many times someone said, why don't you ask Brian what he thinks? I mean, in the conversation, we weren't in the conversation, but so many people said, why don't you ask Brian what he thinks? And it's happened multiple times from multiple people. And I always find myself, yeah, why don't I call Brian? And then I'd call you and leave a very long message, and the wrong numbers and everything. Yes, you are wise, which brings us to today, right? Because we have questions, and Brian's going to give us some answers. Wise answers.
Thank you, thank you.
So, Brian Preston.
I very much appreciated being asked to do this by Sarah, and I appreciate your being here, whether virtually or obviously in body. And I just also really appreciated the questions that I got. I was a little worried because dear friends of mine who live in Edmonton, Alberta, were listening to the radio one day when there was a rather knowledgeable musician who was taking calls into the radio station, and people could ask questions to him. And one of the questions that came in said, "Excuse me, sir, but could you help me to know, is the correct pronunciation of the composer Schubert or Schumann?" So thank you for none of those new songs. That's for sure. I have three thoughts to start off with. We should always judge our own teaching by the successes of our least talented students, not by the best ones. The second thought. Today I hope to offer some thoughts that you will find objectionable or controversial, so that you'll go home and consider what it is that you do right and correct, and why there may be room for some other thought in your own teaching. If that takes effect, then we can say that this has been a great success today. And the third thing is, remember, there is no one blessed way to do anything. So one of the latter questions I got, I realized, was sort of an umbrella for a lot of other things. So I'm starting with that. What would be a typical weekly lesson assignment for a first-year student, an intermediate level student, and an early advanced high school student? And what would your expectations concerning the amount of practice time be? So once lessons have gotten started and the student is working at reading 3 or 4 notes, and for many of us, that would be in the right hand from middle C up 3 or 4 notes, left hand from middle C down 3 or 4 notes, depending on what method we may use. I would probably be assigning about 5 or 6 little pieces each week from the 3 primer books that I tend to use, because I want them doing a lot of reading as much as is at all possible. But the one thing that I try very hard to do is to make sure that they play as many different finger positions on the piano as possible. So many of our traditional methods have been with the thumbs on middle C, and you're never going to get away with that, or from that, because if you look at the Gold Cup pieces that we get to choose from the beginning kids, a majority are like that. But what I will do is look at those pieces and I'll say, perhaps I could change this. So instead of using my thumbs, I don't need all the keys. I'll have both second fingers hanging over the middle C and the thumbs just being loose. Or perhaps middle C with the right hand, B and A and G with the left hand, etc., etc. So again, that we're not overdoing the same fingering position all the time. Now, the truth is that that requires a whole lot of tough teaching. But you're saving yourself time at the other end, because people aren't just learning to play the same patterns of the same fingers with the same notes. And then when you have to move away from that, which you eventually have to if they're going to really play the piano, then you're going to have a little bit better time with that, and they realize the reality of reading notes. I rarely assign the student more pieces than I can teach or work through in a lesson. Now, I don't teach half-an-hour lessons. I teach what I call a 40-minute lesson. It's based on 3/4 of an hour. So that may change from studio to studio, I realize. The lesson is the time to develop those good habits and avoid as many poor ones as possible. There are going to be plenty of poor ones that will come back, but at least if you've introduced the idea, you can get at it better if you've told the student that right from the beginning. Now, later on, I will assign some pieces. that I have not had a chance to go over in the lesson, but instead I've thoroughly edited the piece for the child so that there are copious amounts of directions about what to do. There's no question about what fingering to use. There's no question about where a hand may need to lift or how to coordinate a particular thing, where the left hand and right hand have to do some unusual technical item. So that is already set. And I usually do it in the lesson because my time is limited during the week. Some pieces I'll have already edited, and others I just have to take some time and then talk about the piece as I do edit it. Now, if we're going to talk about second or third year elementary still, kind of a student, I would be assigning about maybe 4 pieces a week, and at certain points, certainly for like our student achievement or not Gold Cup because it only requires 2, but perhaps pare that down depending on where we are in the year. Depending on the student, midway through the first year and surely in the second year, we are playing 8th notes and the easier key signatures. Staples of my teaching are the 2 books by Glover called Chords and Keys, Levels 1 and 2. Now, those books have 1 piece in every single major key, including 7 sharps and 7 flats. I don't use the 7 sharps and 7 flats. I think that's a little bit over the top. But we do from C major with nothing straight through 6 flats, and the same with the sharps, from 1 sharp all the way through to 6 sharps. And so by the time they have finished that book, which is usually doable in a year's time, they are short pieces, so just 1 page, but you know that can't be like the major focus of repertoire. By the time they finish that, they've played 1 little piece using the 1 chord and the 5/7 chord in the accompaniment in every major key. Now, the right hand will usually start the melody, and in book level 1, it's just a 5-finger position, and most of those pieces are folk tune-like things. And then sometimes they will switch to the melody in the left hand, and the right hand has the chords. So there is a variety in the books. Level 2 moves us on to melodies that are slightly larger than 5 fingers, so they may have to move out of an initial position. But then they also add the 4 chords. So once again, by the time you finish that second book, they've played a piece in every single major key. I don't think the fact that we're missing the minor keys matters because we're still having to deal with the key signatures. And that's what's really what it's all about. I know when I was growing up, I played a lot of hymns. And in those days, the hymnals were not dumbed down like they are in today's world. We actually had key signatures that might be even G flat, A flat, A major, B major, etc. I realize now we don't have that anymore, but that's one of the things that taught me, and I'll probably say this again somewhere along the line, but that's one of the things that taught me so much about reading music. Most importantly, in these new levels, in the early levels, the new material that I'm introducing, I want to then plateau in the learning just a little bit and fill in around the gaps so that there might be several other pieces that have that same skill that I've just been teaching, or those same new notes, so that I'm not constantly every week adding and adding and adding. If I'm adding, it's going to be little tiny things. For intermediate students, I would typically have them playing 3 or 4 pieces at a time. The trick at all levels, however, is to avoid starting new pieces all at the very same time, because the child usually feels as if they can't play anything, and they're frustrated about their music. I remember being there too, because I'd get 3 brand new pieces, and they were all tricky for me at that moment, and I'm like, wow, I can't do anything, I want to quit, what are we going to do? And it's usually best to stagger the learning in that some of the pieces should be easier and some of them could be a little bit more challenging. But you can bet that I usually begin the lessons with the piece that's the most challenging. That's because it's when their concentration is the sharpest. Then I recommend to them that they do the very same thing at home. In a sense, it's like eat your meat and vegetables before going on to the dessert. So I would say please start with the tougher piece while you're thinking really well, and then go and enjoy yourself with the ones that you're playing so much better. One of the most important things for my students is having them practice the day after the lesson. I will say, if you have to miss a day, please don't miss the day after the lesson, because that's when you're going to remember what we just did. If you're going to miss one, do it 2, 3, 4 days afterwards. And what I think happens is, when they get themselves to practice that day after the lesson, they're going to practice most of the others because it's less painful. But when you wait 2 or 3 days and you've forgotten everything, it doesn't feel good, and it's aggravating. I wouldn't want to do it either. I do not teach a regular regimen of scales, arpeggios, and etudes at any level except collegiate. For those of you who just fainted, I'm going to say that sentence again. I do not teach a regular regimen of scales, arpeggios, and etudes at any level except collegiate. Okay, I myself was raised having to learn all those rudiments, including all 3 minor scales and all the scales in 3rd, 6th, and 10th, and so forth. But it was rather apparent to most of my teachers from the age of 8 that I was probably going to be a pianist. So learning those was a reasonable expectation. But concerning those rudiments, I deal with every student differently, and you will find that at different times during the year, I will teach a scale or 2, an arpeggio or 2. And depending again on what their needs are, who I think they are, and what they can tolerate. But for me, repertoire is more important, part of what needs to be the every week. Personally, if I had to choose between teaching scales or arpeggios, I would definitely teach arpeggios, because I feel that there's so much more to learn about getting around the keyboard and about piano playing by knowing those. Now for me, I just never got the connection between learning scales and being able to play in a given key. So if I learned the A major scale, it just did not have any effect on making it easier for me to play in the key of A major. I simply just didn't get it. In fact, I can remember at about age 8 or 9, trying to apply the scale fingerings that I had just learned in a given key to a Clementi sonatina and then to a Kuhlau sonatina. So I just went and I filled all, okay, there's the scale, we will use the exact fingerings I just learned. And of course it was a miserable failure, because you just can't do that verbatim. You can apply the understanding of scale fingering, but not cut and paste. So as a child, I felt deceived by what should have been a great help to my piano playing and my music reading, and I was mad about it. You can tell I'm still And honestly, I don't use scales in my everyday life. I certainly don't use the natural minor and the melodic minor. Okay, I'm glad I learned some of it, but I often think, what if I had just learned a few and then gone on to more repertoire? Might that have been sufficient? I don't know. By the way, Jean, just so you know, I said at the very beginning, I hope some of the things that I say you find objectionable and they irk you, so that it allows each one of us to question our own teaching and maybe say, no, I'm right, and Brian's wrong, or maybe, oh, I should maybe rethink that and do something a little different. So just wanted to make sure you know where I was coming from with some of these things. Most of our students are not going to go into music. For the majority of players, when they become adults, I seriously doubt that they're going to sit down and play scales and arpeggios for enjoyment. That's why I focus on repertoire and making sure that they can learn music that will be a source of enjoyment in the rest of their lives. I do try to also ask them sometimes to find music that they would like to play on their own. But having them always play the scale and the arpeggio of the piece that they're about to play, I find it a little bit busy work. And life is busy, and I want to use that limited time that we have for the most practical application I can come up with. But if they've got a scale on a piece, it's going to be good, or we're going to aim for it to be good. So what do I do about teaching technique? I do that through the pieces, which is where it has the most practical application. Technique is about serving the music that needs to be created, not the other way around. I would surmise that if you ask most of my students what technique they've learned with me, they might have to think about that answer. And one of the reasons would be that I often use the word skills instead of technique. In 99% of the cases in my class, what we work on technically is done to create a musical effect or feeling. It's rarely for that sake of technique for technique's sake. From my study of pedagogical history, I believe that 200 and 300 years ago, when teaching the keyboard was still in its infancy, and teachers didn't know that much, students had to play a myriad of exercises and etudes to learn how to negotiate the keyboard. And now we've kind of carried all of those traditions into present day. And my teacher taught me to do it this way, and their teacher taught them to do it this way. Is there maybe a better way? It's worth looking into. When I was a young teacher, I thought that teaching skills or technique as a separate item would ensure that students would demonstrate those skills in the upcoming pieces. Boy, that was a nice dream. It just didn't happen. I've had so many more successes by attaching the skills and the technique to the actual pieces and getting students to play those in similar passages as long as there are gentle reminders. Well, maybe 50 gentle reminders, but gentle reminders. So for me, teaching the technique separately from the music is often busy work. Gratefully, my most two remarkable influential teachers taught me in this more modern pedagogical way, without so much attention. Yes, I did learn the scales and arpeggios, and I did learn some etudes. But when Darcy at Wharton realized Brian's not going to practice that chair music, she said, okay, let's get out the Chopin etudes and see what we can do with those. And that was the beginning of great successes. I realized not all of our students are going to manage Chopin etudes. For my early advanced students, we are usually working on 2 or 3 pieces of repertoire at a time. Even from the intermediate level, however, we're choosing a variety of repertoire styles. Learning a variety actually teaches technique and musical concepts. What you learn in Bach and Mozart is imperative for learning Chopin, Prokofiev, Cherepnin, and the more challenging teaching pieces that we love to do by Alexander or Rollin and so forth. For advancing players, I find that it's usually the classical era works that take the longest to get to performance level. The vast majority of our students just don't have a natural affinity for those Clementi, Mozart, Kuhlau, Haydn type pieces. It's very, very fussy. It's tough for me too. Now, the final part of the question was about practice expectations. And that's an item that I rarely discuss with students or parents. Sometimes the parents will ask, but then I have to come up with some sort of an answer. But if you have the luxury of starting a student from the beginning, you don't have to mandate a specific amount of time, I don't think. They know if they are doing enough simply by the way the lesson is unfolding. I call myself a goal-oriented teacher. During each lesson, the student needs to be keenly aware of the practice work that we did together. Sometimes I'll say to them, do you realize how much we've done in this piece today? Do you realize how much better it sounds than when you came in? So the goal is to bring back the piece sounding at the very least as good as it sounded by the end of the lesson. And hopefully maybe even a little bit better. But if it's gone downhill, they'll know that I am not too happy with that product. Not by being mean or nasty, but just there's an attitude. Right, Sarah? But by doing the practicing that we did at the lesson at home, that will be what the student needs to realize. When you, the teacher, have started a student in piano, you build these instincts with the student so that only occasionally do you have to tell them, well, you're not quite working up to what I know you're capable of. And of course, we can all have an off week, and that's fine. I'm sure next week is going to be great, as opposed to, and next week better be great. So, when I start a student, there are expectations subconsciously planted right from the beginning. When there are no expectations, you will reap what you have sown. And lastly, I really dislike the old-fashioned idea of setting a timer, and then the student must practice until the timer goes off. Good gracious, this is a sure way to squash a student's enthusiasm. And besides that, they're going to be sitting there practicing over and over mindlessly and probably putting in more and more mistakes. We should be encouraging them with enjoyment and enthusiasm. Yes, they need to play the piece more than once, but what's the reason that they're doing it the second time, and how did we do that in the lesson? What did we aim for? And then I frequently do recommend that they go to the music store and pick out some pieces from musicals or movies that they like and would enjoy exploring. And that way it keeps them at the keyboard a little extra and gives them the entertainment that they would like to have. So I'm going to get a drink of water, and I would entertain any complaints or criticisms or questions or thoughts from any of you, that's for sure.
You mentioned the 3 printers that you use for our.
Yes, you know, I kind of avoided that, although I said them in one of my talks earlier, because they're so old-fashioned. But I'll explain quickly why I still use them. I use John Thompson's easiest piano course as the basic. Then I supplement that with Lila Fletcher's Music Lessons Have Begun. And then I supplement that with the more, difficult isn't the right word, but interesting book. That's the Gillock Accent on Solos Level 1. Now, if you looked at those books, you would see, after a student has done them, you would see that I've taken a black marker and I have taken all the fingerings out, except for the initial one you need in a given hand position, a finger position. I hate the word hand position, but I use it all the time, but a finger position on the keys. And I've also changed which hands are doing what. Not usually by changing the notes. As often as possible, we leave the notes alone. But once in a while, they, oh, look, they have that middle C in the wrong hand. Let's get that out of there, and we'll put that in the treble clef or in the G clef, et cetera, et cetera. So as I said at the beginning, I like to use as many different fingering positions and steer clear as long as possible from the thumbs on middle C. And you know, there's something, I don't care how long they play, there's something, as a beginning, something magnetic about that position of the middle C with the thumbs. They are going to gravitate to it no matter how you try to get rid of it. That's one of the reasons that I teach the chromatic scale at the beginning, going from G up to D and D down to D, which I mentioned earlier on. Didn't I mention that yet? No, I probably haven't, sorry. So that's one of the things that I do at the very first, that's because we haven't talked about legato, apologies. But we'll talk about that in a minute. But I do that so that we have, well, D is a very easy note to locate. 2 black keys go in the middle. And then many of them don't know the up and the down. Like people did know that when I was a child, but I don't know if they're not experimenting with the pianos or whatever at home. But they don't know up and down, so you get the right hand to go up to the next D, the left hand to go down to the next D. And the pattern is so easy to teach. You know, I'm not expecting a fast thing. You know, sometimes it's at a snail's pace, but it gets them to think the finger numbers are just the 1, 2, 3. You have got the whole hand. Once that happens, you can get them to come back down, or the left hand back up. That's much more difficult because they have to remember to put the second finger first. That's all right. And then eventually we do it in contrary motion, which is why I use the D, because the black and the white is exactly the same going from the D. You could use A flat. That's another possibility. That's the other note that will work with that. But I love teaching that early on. So then, if you know what D is, and you A, B, C, D. Oh, what happens before D? Oh, C. Oh, there's the middle C. And we talk about that's in the middle of the clefs, not in the middle of the piano. But it's in the middle of the 2 clefs. So that, you see, I thought for years it was in the middle of the piano, and that's why you call it that. It's not it at all. So a lot of things that I guess I was strangely, well, I was a strange child, I'm sure. Strangely conscientious, and I took everything seriously, and I just remembered what people said, and I took it like it was law, until I could figure out, oh, well, that's not really it at all. And that's what I'm trying to break loose of a little bit in my teaching. I'm sure I'm not totally successful, like none of us are 100%, but we try. So, yeah. Any other thoughts before we go? All right. Well, we had a wonderful question, and I was jumping ahead. When do I begin teaching legato touch? I teach legato right from the first lesson, and more specifically, I teach legato as soon as the student can learn to play 2 notes consecutively. In the first piano lesson, as I already mentioned, I teach the chromatic scale. Now, many of the students, even if they're 4 and 5, can do that. They can negotiate that. I show them how it looks. I give them the rules. Third finger always on the black key, thumb on the white keys. I don't say always, thumb on the white keys, second finger's on the extra key. If they can't attach the notes together, then I might talk to them about, just hold the third finger, for instance. Hold the third finger, don't let it up. Now go ahead and press the thumb. Oh, great, maybe it blurred. I could care less. All right, now I'll let the third finger up. I was too conscientious about blurring fingers early on. It's okay to let some of that go until you get what you need, and then add that into it. Oh, that doesn't sound so good. Let's let the third finger up, whatever the case might be. Then there'll be some children who just are not coordinated at the beginning. And I have one who's been a great success, and she could do nothing at the start. And I would have to negotiate her fingers. I don't know if that's her. Or hold everything. Okay, I held that one, and then I would press the thumb, and she finally got the message. But I would have to do everything with my 2 hands, with her fingers. And it worked. So, just that I didn't miss anything about that. Oh, of course, one of the biggest problems is then when we start into pieces will have skips and steps, and they'll have repeated notes. The repeated notes are always the most difficult thing. I can tell you that when we're playing in a nice tempo and playing steps and maybe 1 skip here and there, and then we get to the repeated note, they sit there like, it's because we're not used to, and I remember the same thing with me. We're not used to having to let the key come up, and it's a totally different feeling. So I do teach legato right from the beginning. And as I've already kind of suggested, I will say, just hold your finger on that note until you hear the second note. I try not to talk about what's going to happen as much as what is happening. And that seems to work better. If I say, now when you play the second note, they're already letting go of that first one. I think one of the worst things is when we let the children just chop, chop, chop from note to note to note, because it becomes so difficult to fix. I think the only thing that's harder to fix than that is pedaling, when they haven't learned how to pedal at all well at the beginning. So that chop, chop, chop is just really difficult. And I've been finding that, I started several beginners this year, and I've been finding that they're realizing when they get to the last of a series of repeated notes, they can just go legato to the next one. And I'm not having to say it. So the instincts are being built, and that's just a wonderful thing. Again, if there's anybody who wants anything to say or complain about, you're welcome. How do I teach phrasing? So, for me, what made the light bulb go on was when I realized in my own singing and in my accompanying and singing in school and church, that was the clue to understanding phrasing. As a young student, I was extremely conscientious about holding all the notes for their full written length. And it puzzled me how I was supposed to, for an example, hold a whole note chord for the complete 4 beats and then have to repeat that chord in the next measure, because where was the rest? Where was the indication by the composer that I was allowed to let that first chord go so that I could go on to the next one? The composer did not actually indicate that there was any rest before repeating that chord or that note. So I was cheating, and I didn't like that. I actually had a terrible guilty feeling about how this cheating, letting the note go, was just going to permeate my whole playing, and I would just be terrible. I really think that guilt tied me in knots, technical knots from time to time. When I began participating in choirs and choruses, I realized that if I was going to continue singing for any length of time, I was going to have to take a breath at the ends of sentences or clauses. That was the first time it occurred to me that composers did not mean for a singer to hold the last note of a phrase for its full value, because the tempo would suffer if you did not taper off the note a little bit early to catch that breath. For me, this should be imitated early on in piano. In my opinion, students need to feel that moment of tapering the sound at the end of a phrase and at some musical gestures. In a sense, I had to get over the fear of those little silences in my playing that imitated the breathing that a singer would create. Now, don't misunderstand me. I know that all of this evolves. We don't think as an adult or as a teenager the way we did when we were 5 and 6 years old. And I'm still evolving in my understanding of phrasing, that's for sure. So to answer the question a bit more practically, I tend to teach young students to breathe at the piano with what I call a float up at the ends of phrases. I'm going to demonstrate in just a minute. Or sometimes it's at a special musical gesture. That float up happens with the wrist and the back of the hand, keeping the fingers hanging loosely, not pushed down, just hanging there loosely. And you can see this with professional pianists all the time if you watch a video. Learning that motion is the most important technique that I offer my students and myself for relaxation, for fluidity, for understanding where a breath can happen. And it's just an endless amount of examples that you can come up with. One of the earliest piece that I teach this in is in the Gillard Accent on Solos Book 1. Now, unfortunately, they've reprinted the book and they've taken out all the phrases. I don't know if they've taken out the words, I can't remember. I probably am so disgusted about the fact that they take out the phrases that I can't even bother to look for the words. But I know what they are. So Snowman works like this. Snowman, snowman, you're such fun. Glad you came today. You're a friend to everyone. Please, oh, please don't melt away. Now, in the first part, it used to be that we had 2-note slurs over the snowman. Snowman, you're such fun. Very poetic. And so that's why I use the 2-note slurs there. So that it imitates the way that it would sound if you were saying it poetically, expressively. Now, in the second line, it's the same notes for a while, but it's a full sentence. You're a friend to everyone. So we don't want it that line. You're a friend to everyone, because it doesn't make sense. And that's just a lovely thing to even talk with little kids about, because they get that. They get that. And I think they basically enjoy the movement, and that's the start. Yes, it can be overdone, and I have to watch myself that I don't OD on it, but I do think that has made a good addition to my teaching that can then evolve. And then I also find that many times when there's an accompaniment and you've got a staccato in the left hand at the end of a right hand phrase note, that, learning to coordinate the two of those together is a beautiful opportunity to learn, these both can happen at the very same time.
Brian, can I just ask a
You
comment?
sure can. Yes, the drop roll thing.
And
I don't deal with that, no. But that's sort of the rotation, isn't it?
yeah.
Yep, Natasha.
How explicitly do you find you have to address that the last note has to be soft? How often do you get snowman?
Just about to talk about that.
Okay.
It all depends again on the struggles of the individual student. So, may I say, Kathy asked me the question about phrasing, and so I wasn't sure if you meant what I just talked about or about phrase shaping. So, often that's what we're actually talking about when we're talking about phrasing is, the ups and the downs of a phrase. Once a student can demonstrate basic forte in piano, which may not mean an innuendo at the end of a phrase quite yet, it all depends on the student, then I'll initiate more of the expressiveness in there because they're getting the idea. And then I will say to them, oh, that was so artistic. They love that. Who doesn't want to be an artist? I try to avoid it. Once upon a time I used the word professional. They don't want to be a professional. They like being an artist. So I'm noticing also, just in my own teaching, I've been doing much more of that, initiating the shaping earlier and earlier, and asking them to do more on their own. Can you show me as it goes up, or can you show me that it's coming to an end? And I'm just amazed. I don't sometimes ask as much as I probably should, because children are very capable. It's just that when you as the teacher get weighed down with we need to do this and this and this, sometimes we get carried away. It's very important to keep reminding oneself what we're really all about. Yeah, exactly. Anything else before we? Well, exercises to encourage wrist rotation. I'm sure everyone here knows everything about rotation. You're going, what exactly is this? I hope you're saying this. I don't think I ever use the word rotation when I'm teaching pre-college students. The literal definition is the action of moving in a circle around an axis or a center. That just doesn't sound like something in piano playing to me. On top of that, we should understand that the concept of rotation has two parts. There's single rotation and double rotation. Doesn't all that sound easy to learn for a child under the age of 18? The average student, I don't think, is going to be that fascinated by it. But we can instigate the same things that rotation offers into their playing without even getting into all of the minuscule definitions. Tobias Mattei, the world-class English piano teacher from the turn of the last century, is given credit for coming up with the term rotation. Attempting to define the term rotation can get a teacher into a great deal of trouble depending on what other experts he or she is talking to. A number of summers ago, I heard John Perry speak about rotation. John is now 90 and still teaching up a storm, and he worked with two Mattei disciples, so to speak. One was Frank Mannheimer, who taught many successful professionals in Duluth, Minnesota during summers. Mannheimer worked extensively with Mattei early on. So Mattei being the rotation person, Mannheimer certainly taught that as well. The other teacher Perry worked with was Cecile Ganhart at the Eastman School of Music. She only had one summer with Mattei, but it changed her life and formed her whole teaching philosophy, both technically and musically especially. So if anyone alive knows anything about rotation technique, it's John Perry. When asked about rotation, John said it was actually very simple. We must never forget that everything starts with the finger, and that rotation happens as a product of the relaxation of the arm, allowing the arm to help do the work for whatever the finger needs. So if you were playing a second finger on a key, and you needed to go to the fourth finger, the rotation helps you, this circling feeling helps you to, in a relaxed way, get to the next note. That's how I define what he was trying to tell us. And he said, we must never forget that everything starts with the finger, and that rotation happens as a product of relaxation of the arm following the arm to help do the work for whatever the finger needs. When you start with the arm first, that's the problem. Too many people think that rotation starts with an arm motion. It has to start with the finger being there and getting engaged and having the arm help. Using rotation, the muscular flexibility engaged delivers a curvy line motion instead of a stiff and rigid motion. And this is really what it's all very much about. So as far as exercises for those go, we can practice all these swing things as much as we want. But then if we play the piece up to speed and the arm stiffens and locks, then you've done nothing good for yourself. To simplify for my own teaching, to take all the headiness out of it, I often ask the student to ask themselves to keep monitoring their arms to see if they're feeling bouncy and elastic during a passage, to make sure that when they're playing with a good firm hand position, there's still this elasticity and lack of stiffness as they're playing a given passage. One other expression that I like to use is that a note needs a wind-up feeling in the same way that you do with a sports racket or a bat when you wind up to hit the ball. And this is very important in piano, as well as having a follow-through. So perhaps you are going to play from here to here, and then there's going to be a follow-through. There's a relax, there's a recoil, and up feeling where, yes, you may be holding the note, but you're not bearing down on it still. And all of these little things, as we're moving into more and more advanced repertoire, allow technique to happen. They don't add technique to me, they allow it to happen. So a little difference in the way of discussing that. I guess you could say, well, it is a kind of technique, it is a kind of a skill. It's those curvy line motions that we're looking for when we play. And there's a difference in the sound, and I wouldn't begin to tell you scientifically why, and I could care less, because if we take all the magic out of our art and it just becomes science and math, it's no good anymore. And I'm happy to listen to anything anybody has to say. Elizabeth, am I loud enough or too loud? Okay. All right. Could I explain what lilt is? Now, Teddy just sent that one in. Now, I don't think I know what lilt is, so I looked it up. And I said, in music, what is lilt? And you're going to maybe help me here, but let me finish what I want to say. It says, the characteristic rising and falling of the voice, often seen as lively and cheerful or melodious. It can also refer to a pleasant, gentle, rhythmic swing or movement. All the images that I saw posted for lilts were 6/8 timepieces. And it said that the Irish accent is often called an Irish lilt. Now, can you help me with, was that what?
I had trouble with this because I looked at 5 different resource books and couldn't find any definition of lilt.
And where, is this in a tempo marking maybe, with a something lilt?
I see it often. I see it very often. And there was one particular one I should have brought it in Rollins' lyric praise.
I had a feeling it was a Rollin piece.
And I should have looked it up.
Well, she's the person to ask about.
Melody Boger has it.
Okay.
With a lilt.
So it sounds to me the rising and falling is really the key that we hear the dum da dum
Is it, I sometimes think it's a little more delayed getting to the second beat, or is it?
Well, now that Elier and I discussed this, and he thought it was perhaps about something you talk about with a Viennese waltz. And I looked that up specifically, and I didn't see anything about that. So I would, if I were you, just go on and ask in music with a little, and there will be some musical examples, and then listen and see if it makes any more sense. I'm sorry not to be able to. So, but I did look it up, and I did try.
In the lilt of Irish laughter, you can hear the gaze.
Oh, in the lilt of Irish, I thought we could
isn't it still
It's
the
almost
beginning? It's the
undefinable.
beginning part of a phrase usually, beginning.
I
I think it's within the first three.
An upswing at the beginning.
I think so. But I
Yum,
couldn't define it.
ta-da,
I was trying to define it for one of my students. I said, I'll go down my books. I couldn't find something.
Well, very interesting. It's a subject still out for
Good.
definition there. That's for sure defining. Beverly, did you? Oh, I thought you were doing it. Yeah, right, very good. So, how do I teach, or how does one teach Baroque ornamentation? Very poor. Oh, no. Okay, I am imagining that this question stems from some of the more academic editions of Bach that are out there. God, I bought one from Christopher Taylor, thinking, oh, I've met Chris. He's such a brainy guy. I bet it's going to be marvelous. I so wish I hadn't bought it. You will see that the trill will be written out above where it's supposed to be played, and there'll be a series of 64th notes, and then there'll be a tie into something that's almost indefinable about what measurement it is, and then you hold the last note of the trill until the next one. Gosh, I would never play Bach if I had had to deal with all that. I wouldn't be able to do it, my students wouldn't be able to do it. I can't use that kind of an addition. It might be great for a serious harpsichordist, but it just doesn't work on the piano, and certainly not with our students. Okay, maybe Angela Hewitt can do these kinds of things, but yeah, we mortals. So, and then I have more things that I was upset about. Why would a publisher get sold a bill of goods that this would be good for our students? So here's what I do with trills. If the main note value in a piece is 8 notes, I fill out the trill by having 2/16 per 8. And I realize that there can be ornaments where that won't work, and you have to take each one into consideration. But if we're in a piece where you have quarter notes, then maybe you can still fill out with 4/16 notes, but basically 8ths with 2 in between. And if the trill is not really significant to the piece and is causing a problem, it's all right to leave it out. This is okay in Baroque music. When I teach my collegiate students and more inquisitive pre-college students about trills throughout the history of music, then these are some of the things that I say. In all styles, trills are played using the note you see on the page with the diatonic note above it. In other words, whatever's in the scale above it. Doesn't matter who the composer is. If it's a B and you're in the key of D major, you're going to play a D and a C sharp. The only exception to the C sharp would be if the composer would write an actual sign above the trill saying that that extra note is going to be an actual, or perhaps it could be a flat or it could be a sharp depending on the key signature. In the Baroque music era, musicians started the trills on that upper note, the one that's not written on the page. That is because the one that's on the page belongs to the implied harmony in the passage. The note above the one on the page is dissonant to that harmony. Since dissonances always needed to be resolved until we get to the 20th century, at least, hearing the sting of the dissonance first propels the music because our ears cannot rest. For the harpsichord and the organ, this concept was invaluable in musical flow because those trills were always propelling the line forward through dissonance first and speed as well. So I'm going to just say in one Bach invention here, let's say the one in G. So the next chord that is in the left hand, even though it's broken, is a D major chord. And that's the first note of the trill. And that's what we want. We want that in Baroque music, to hear the wrong note first, and then it will resolve. Because our ear, even though we don't officially say, oh, that was tough on my ear, but our ears do pick up on that, and it has to keep moving forward. I should also say that, yes, thank you. I should also say that if you're dealing with mortars, the ones that go dee-da-dum, okay, always try them first as a half step, even if it doesn't fit with the key signature. I read a wonderful article that I've never been able to find, again, by Rosalind Turk, talking about how the mordant was an ornament that based itself on modal things, because in the Baroque era, modal things were definitely still part of the compositional world. And there are many times that a half step will be really what you want. The only time that I would definitely not use a half step in a mordant is when it would change the implied harmony from major to minor and back. In other words, if you were dealing with a C major chord and you did an ornament, a mordant on an E, I would not want to go to E flat because that's not the point. You're not supposed to change harmony from C major to C minor and then back again. I would then use the whole step. But always check out the half step there. I wasn't going to talk about that today, but just came to me and decided we would. Now, I'm going to skip ahead to the Romantic era. And at that point in time, what I explained to my college students is that things had changed in composition. Dissonance and consonants were relaxed in a different way. You could put a dissonance on a downbeat in a piece. You could start a piece with something that was very dissonant, and it was okay. So it was no longer the same problem with trills. It was Beethoven's younger composer friend, Hummel, for English-speaking people, but Hummel, who decided that it was now time to probably change trills and start them on the main note, the note that belonged with the harmony, the beautiful note. And that was the whole point, that now a trill was going to be the beautification of a main note by just adding that note above it. Not the dissonance, but the loveliness of it. Now, if we go to the classical period, we could probably be here until tomorrow morning trying to discuss that, and I just won't even begin to try to be an expert on it. There are loads of books out there that can tell you the possibilities. But I would say you could simplify it this way. If it's a slow lyrical piece, do it the Baroque way. Play the grace notes on the beat, because the grace notes are going to be dissonant notes in general. Play the trill starting on the upper notes. And if it's a fast movement, do the grace notes before the beat, like yum, yum, yum. And probably your trills could be the dissonance, could be the consonants, depending on the particular passage. There can't be exactly a hard and fast rule. It changes during the classical era. Do people are we in agreement sort of on that? Okay, all right, excellent. Then moving up past that, prerequisite pieces to learning two-part inventions. So most of my students who are learning a two-part invention have already played 5 or 6 of the important works from the Anna Magdalena Bach book. And most of them have also performed a few of those. Now, once upon a time, I used to think that students had to have played some of the little preludes of Bach and some of the dances from the French suites in order to be ready for the two-part inventions. I no longer believe that. It's simply because those other pieces, the preludes and the dances, do not really lead to the inventions. And in many ways, those pieces have fussy complications in voicing and in their compositional needs. The two-part inventions are actually quite straightforward two-part pieces with no irregularities in the composition. So I would answer the question about what are the prerequisites for the two-part invention by saying, what prerequisites does the teacher need before teaching the two-part inventions? It's a huge responsibility on me. I firmly believe that if you have thoroughly edited the edition of the invention you are going to teach, and the student shows at least a mild aptitude to playing such a serious work, then the onus is only on the teachers. The students have to be willing to follow instructions to a T, and the teacher cannot give any wiggle room for letting the student do just whatever they want to do. It says staccato there, we're going to play staccato. It says legato there, we have to play legato. It says third finger there, we are not going to use a second or fourth. That is why giving a student who comes to you and has never had any expectations taught to them before that should never be given a two-part intervention as one of their first pieces in your class. It will be a disaster if you have expectations. If you're dealing with a student you've already started, you will know when they are ready. And I just brought my edition of one of the inventions that I will show you here so that you can see that I have all kinds of fingerings, markings, arrows, slurs, whatnot, just to give as much instruction as possible. Oh, yeah, you want to go? That'd be fine. So I have to be the one that's totally prepared for that piece. Know exactly what everything is going to unfold in it, how the trill is going to work, how many notes, and how it works out rhythmically, all those kinds of things. And then the student is going to be able to be successful, I think. It's still difficult, but they're going to be able to be successful. It's kind of the story with almost all of the music pieces, honestly. The teacher has to be super ready for that. We can't be guessing what we want to do if the student is going to be successful. After encouraging a good hand position for years, how do I get students to play on finger pads without the joints caving in? How do I teach piano or pianissimo playing technically with finger pads or fingertips? In my first lesson at the Eastman School with Cecile Denhart, she said to me, "You need to play with flat fingers in this passage." And I thought, oh my God, you mean I spent all those years developing my curved fingers and not letting those joints caving in, and now I have a world-class teacher here who's telling me I have to use flat fingers? And the truth is that she asked for every single possibility that you can imagine. Sometimes she would say, play on your fingernails as if you're going to scratch to get a very light and crisp sound. One of her most marvelous suggestions was to press a key, and this was usually in difficult technical passages. Press the key at the first joint, here, not at the tip, but right there, sometimes the second finger, sometimes the third. Press it at the first joint, and wow, did that change my musical control and technical accuracy. And I can teach this to my students, and it just changes their ability to get something, and it also gives a beautiful tone, because everything is flat, and you're not going to jab at it. Now, if you think that these ideas are crazy, just watch Horowitz on video. He does absolutely every single one of them, and I can guarantee you, he didn't study with Mrs. Denhart, and she didn't study with him. So, it's just something people realized as they were teaching and playing. Oh, this is how I'm going to get what I need. And in a sense, I think she would say, as long as you remain subtle. Relaxed is a nice word, but I don't always like that word because we usually think of relaxed. and it's not that. Now, of course, you cannot teach these items to inexperienced youngsters. I get that totally. It's something that you develop along the way. There has to be a few basics in order to establish ground zero before departing into wider varieties. I was taught to curve my fingers when I was a kid. I was taught that the nail joint should not cave in, and that there were many other wrist and elbow things that were enforced. In my teaching, I do not tell my students to curve their fingers, and it's been decades since I told them not to let the nail joint cave in. I found that all those rigid rules were so constricting and frustrating for me and the student. Sometimes it almost seemed as if there wasn't a single note that could be played without criticism of their finger position. That's not a piano lesson. Their music making was always under duress. So now in my 55th year of teaching, I have a few basic pianistic positions that I aim for, and it all seems that they yield a tremendous amount of ability for the student to get around the keyboard. The first item is making sure hanging this way, but supported. That is, however, not something that I asked from day one. There are so many items to deal with early on because they don't know anything, and I will allow the student a lot of leeway in lieu of accuracy and rhythm. However, once the student can realize that there is a reason to establish a good hand position, I introduce it then. And the reason usually occurs when they know that they're having finger struggles, or that the notes are not clear, they're not evenly spaced, and they're tonally not similar as they should be. At that point, we start the journey to establish a supported up hand. And in a sense, for me, it's like there's a little ski slope from the wrist to there, and a ski slope back to the elbow, just a little one. And then, of course, the elbows need to hang loosely, and the shoulders have to be just in a regular down position. Now, for some students, getting that pattern can be a Mount Everest. But overwhelming them with too many directions can be unsettling. So I will just be happy with almost anything, even if for a couple of weeks I have to put up with that. Usually we don't, but one step at a time is the important thing. But that straining and awkwardness that can happen before they get to having the supported hand position, I think usually convinces them, aha, this does need to be negotiated. One of the best things that I've learned to say for promoting a supported hand, and Bobby and I were talking about this on the way in, is use tall fingers, or use standing fingers, or point your fingers. Once that element settles in, the outcome usually delivers what you want. The concept of flatter fingers is so useful in a myriad of things, and you have to go one passage at a time. But say, for instance, if you had a student that ever got to the Aeolian harp etude, you can't play that with curved fingers. It has to be, this kind of a way with the ins and outs. And in that, many times, playing toward the first joint instead of at the fingertip is far superior than aiming for the fingertips. Because, well, you just have to try it. And the last question I had was, what instructional gems from Cecile Genhardt, my mentor at the Easton School of Music, do I use in my teaching? And Jean, I'm going to answer this differently than probably what you had in mind, because we could have an entire lecture about her principles of piano playing, and I just didn't want to add all that today. But what I will first say is I can barely think of a thing that I teach that hasn't stemmed from my 8 years with Mrs. Genhardt at Easton. After I had worked with her for 5 or 6 years, I thought that I would know everything she would say when I brought in a new piece. And I was always so wrong. Just when I thought I had it all figured out, well, I did what she said in all the last 20 pieces, and I did the shaping the right way, and I had the style the right way, and she would have something new that I had never thought of before that came out of her musical imagination. And that's what made working with her so fascinating and magnetic. You just wanted to be there. You wanted to find out, gosh, what other new revelations could there be? So one of the big concepts that I learned was to focus less on a student's strengths and to work first on their weaknesses while appreciating their strengths. The strengths will always be there, and we will focus mostly, and if we focus mostly on those strengths, they will eventually shadow the weaknesses that have not been fixed. By doing that, we develop pianists who are fakes. Those are the players who have flash, but never bothered to take care of the fussy details that were hard for them. This is the student who can't play a fugue of Bach, but can play a transcendental etude. But what's really going on in that transcendental etude may be less wonderful because they never did the fugue of Bach well. Of course, for a teacher, working to strengthen a student's weaknesses is much harder work, and it takes real, strong teaching, not just painting pretty pictures and imaginative scenes. And by the way, if you ever feel that you're getting too old to teach, remember that I was with Mrs. Genhardt as her student from the time she was about 75 until she had passed her 83rd birthday. She never ceased working hard with me on my weaknesses or strengths, no matter how difficult I was. There was no task that was too elementary for her to work on with you either. I'm telling you, you can go to a lot of conservatory teachers and they expect you to fix this, that, and the other. And you may fix it, but will it be economically fixed and well understood, or is it done just out of playing it over and over again until it corrects itself? Sarah, I know you know. You've been there, fear, out of fear. Cecile Genhardt always bragged that she never earned a degree like bachelor's, master's, DMA. They didn't have those degrees in Switzerland when she grew up, but she did have 3 diplomas, one in piano performance, one in theory, and one in composition. She would often say, imagine me, a woman, a composer. Because in those days, of course, women being a composer wasn't really a thing yet. I mention all this because my lessons were permeated by discussions about what was going on theoretically and compositionally beyond the performance concepts. She would occasionally criticize what a composer had written and explain why it was somewhat weak. But the names Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven never came up in those sentences that had the word weakness in it. And she would always start, well, I go down on my knees, but Chopin did so-and-so, so-and-so here. Meaning, I'm sorry, I have to apologize, but this isn't quite maybe what should be. After talking about the problematic issues in a composition, she would then give you direction about how to avoid showing up those weaknesses by strengthening them interpretively. And this is what I wanted to pass, again, Jean, as opposed to just the little tiny details. So one example might be playing a long sequence of repetitive patterns in Schumann, where he goes da da dee da 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 da, and it goes on and on for a line and a half or so. And she would show you ways to shape and color it and voice it occasionally differently, so that that repetitiveness wasn't being displayed so blatantly. She would also point out where in the sequence a most evocative harmony might be hidden, so that you were able to bring that a little bit out and then take your mind away from just all this constant repetitiveness. Perhaps there was a strong dissonance in distant registers of the piano in a sweet lyrical phrase. How could we treat that to make it more beautiful instead of jarring? The lineup of compositional discussions was endless, but I learned so much about composition in theory without being a composer. For Mrs. Genhardt, harmony was at the top of the list of artistic priorities. I was just reminded in writing this that in the documentary, I hope some of you have seen this, The Art of Piano came back out in the 1990s. I just listened to that with my Nazareth pedagogy class. During that video, Daniel Barenboim states something like this, that harmony was of the ultimate importance to all pianists we have on recording for the first 75 years of the 20th century. Harmony was the most important thing. Much of this has to do with the understanding and feeling of harmonic progression of each phrase. Of course, melody and rhythm lead a line forward, but knowing how the harmonic parts of it affect the leading forward, the intensity, the meaning is at the highest level of artistic endeavor and performance. A student in Mrs. Genhardt's class would never play a passage with a diminished seventh harmony, an augmented harmony, a passage in the Neapolitan key, or an augmented sixth chord, without making sure that its meaning and its importance were clearly part of the unfolding of that piece. You had to know that was there, and it was an event. It wasn't like a 5-1 at the end of the cadence. It was an event. Even a 4 chord in a final cadence. I mean, if you look at cadences in pieces, I'm sure there are only 10% of final cadences that are 4-1. Most of them are 5 or 5-7-1. So even a 4 chord at a cadence had to have a special meaning that was not the same as if it were a 5-7 chord. At a recital of a Genhardt student, it was not unusual for student pianists to leave saying, "Wow, I never knew that that spectacular chord was in the second theme of that sonata. I'd never really heard that before." And one last concept I wanted to mention is how she and her students could have such a liquidy touch and a magical sound in appropriate places. Sadly, I personally am not the perfect example of that. I would have to drop my teaching for 5 years and just do nothing but practice to get back to where it was. But once upon a time, I truly could spin out a line and make phrases that seemed as if there were no bar lines or strong beats in it, that it just kind of went like this. And that is what we as piano teachers should eventually be aiming for. The percussiveness of the piano has to leave, and there has to be this malleable kind of sound and line. So if you can achieve that, even just in one phrase of one student in your life, like I try to do, we will all be huge successes. I have one more thing. I don't want to keep folks too long. Are we okay to, it's all right? Okay. So I thought we should have, Leon Fletcher said to me one time, and now I have to prove that I actually have something to offer by my playing. That's not because of the playing, but I want to show you. I don't know if I'll have enough of these, but we'll.
I can handle this.
My teaching and editing and so forth, yes. Okay. So we're going to do that piece that we all love to hate or hate to love, or as a friend of mine used to call it, furry Elise. We should teach our students how to really pronounce it. Elise. The fur is very difficult. For Elise, you know, because it's not Elise, but I hadn't thought about this piece in a while, and I did a little reading about it, and actually, Beethoven, the original is lost. Unfortunately, there was somebody who supposedly had the original before it was lost, and they wrote down what we kind of know. But eventually, Beethoven actually rewrote it, and he staggered the left hand so that the 16th notes came in on the second 16th, the second 16th measure. So let's see. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. I haven't seen it, but there is a copy of it that exists in his hand. So for whatever. So I wanted to choose this piece because of particularly fingering and pedal things. Now look, pedal is almost impossible to write with a pencil. So I'm just doing a basic job here. Please don't take everything verbatim. But one of the things I want to say about fingering that you'll see a little bit later in the piece as well has to do with how I have the fingering for the very beginning. You'll notice that I have 5-3 and then 5-4 to get us in the position. What I find for that is that the 5-3 going to the other position makes you stay a little supple again, and it could, with a student, initiate a slight leaning on rubato instead of just the 5-4, which sounds so mechanical. Plus, 5 and 3 is so much nicer with something that's tricky with a half step than 5 and 4 or 4 and 3, because those two notes aren't, or those two fingers are not hooked together with that part, which is the fourth finger that we have the problem with. So that's the first little secret that I would recommend there. The other thing that I know when I adjudicate with some people, and the minute you hear the student put the pedal down, and that's really not the sound it's supposed to be there. It's not supposed to be at this moment until here. Is that the pedal should go down on the second 16th note, so we don't pick up the C. Perhaps worse things can be done, but why not teach that here, because there are so where that is necessary, because let's say it had been a B. Who wants to hear that? Right. So if you wait and put it down in the second 16th, then it will be just fine. You won't have any blur there at all. There are a lot of additions, by the way, that when we get to measure 7, have an E in their right hand, and all the modern discussions about it are saying it's a mistake. It probably was just something that blurred. Should be a D, like everywhere else in the piece. And I believe it, because as I was looking at this piece, I think that Beethoven has a compositional idea here that's about this. Is it D sharp? Or is it a D? Is it a D or is it a D sharp? It seems to be juxtaposed throughout the piece. That we sometimes will have a D and sometimes we'll have the D sharp. I don't mean in the same passageway, but I just mean harmonically speaking. So that would be one thing I would recommend there. When we get to measure 12, you see that I have simplified that, because quite often that spot can be very nasty for the children. And you see the dotted line there with the upper slur. I don't think anybody wrote that. I don't think Beethoven ever actually wrote that slur. So what's the problem with facilitating there by using two right hand thumbs? Now, in the next measure, measure 13, you'll see that I use in the right hand 3-1 for the 2-note slur, 3-1 for the left hand slur. Then when I'm getting back into it, I use 3-1, 3-5, 4-5, because every single one of those half steps has a different fingering on it. You won't end up with a child that ends up with 15 extra ones or one less. Just by using a clever fingering, you're going to have success on the number of notes that come out there. And we'll see another place where we're going to use that later on. Let's see. Oh, then I also mark, when we get to the first transitional section in F major, I mark these with a little tenuto with this because they're not going to be able to be legato, and probably pedaling them is out of the question. Too fast wouldn't probably have been done in classical times, especially early music like this was. But not to make them right. And if you ever had any questions about the grace notes there, I do believe those, because it's a lyrical passage, it should be beyond the beat. Now you'll notice that I have a dotted line. Right at the moment when I want to play the left hand on the C, I want the right hand to go to the thumb. At that moment. So you do two things at once. Shift. Then, when we play our F here, we float up, not off. We float up. We float up. Sorry. We float off. Now, why float up on the dotted notes? Did you hear how good the rhythm sounded when I did that? Did you hear how good the tone sounded when I did that? So I'm going to do it again. It allows that rhythm to be generous and luxurious, as opposed to staying stiff on it. It doesn't have the same quality, am I right? You hear that?
When you're floating up, does your finger leave the key?
Look, my finger does not leave the key. Now, if it was a passage that was too big to be able to do legato, yes, I would float off. Let's say it was octaves or with chords, float right off. It's a great place. I remember Mrs. Genhart saying constantly, float up at dotted notes. And the reason is because there's the unspoken beat at which you feel this. It's miraculous. It's miraculous. Yeah. Let's see. Oh, then this measure 26, that little grace note, does not have to be a problem. It is a true snap grace note here. And it should be like another 30-second note that just fits in between the left hand. So why didn't he write that? This is one of the things I always do in my teaching. When I decide it should be like this, why didn't they do it another way? Because then he would have to write a rest, or he would have to write how long the A was going to last before the 32nd note. And that becomes another, for visually, it becomes difficult for us to see. So you have this dotted 16th note, and then it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. So you need not worry about making that. Now you might want to actually literally write in the notes and scribble out in the opposite clef. That's perfectly fine too. But it again will alleviate the problems of too many da 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 da. So it is a D sharp. Well, it seems to be D sharp. Oh no, it's D. I see. That seems to be the conflict in these two. Is it D sharp sound? Or is it always D? That always has to win at the end. The other point before we move past all that is, you know how we're always learning that two-note slurs. The first note has to be the strong one, and the second one has to be the weaker one. Really? Here? I don't think so. Mattei would call this an inverted slur, meaning the one at the beginning is a little softer, the one after is a little stronger. Because you go to the harmony. The second note, the E's are still a little shorter. They're let go, but they're not weaker because we go to the harmonic note instead of letting it limp. But I believe that eventually, after they get used to the ease of doing things in a coordinated, planned way, when they take on something on their own, they're going to also feel, oh, this is how it feels good, and I will be able to imitate that without thinking maybe about it so far. But that's what all those arrows are about. And of course, the pedal will cover those arrows. Nobody, except octopus, would play all of that without it, and it's impossible because of repetition notes anyway. So that would be my recommendation, just to pencil in where things let go, and I apologize that there are a couple of them that I have missed. And I have, let's see, at the bottom line, you'll see in close to the middle, I have some alternate possible fingers where you could do the 4, 3, 2, 1, and then back to all three there. And switch from 3 and 1 to that block that needs to be there. And you'll see in the left hand, I have 3 fingerings to the D flat, just like this, 1, 2, and 3 on the black key. It's so secure, and it also gives a beautiful tone, and it also gives a lot of oomph just where you need that at that moment. Last thing is, if you teach the arpeggios the traditional way of 1, 2, 3, it's much harder. Try doing it in this inverted position that I have. And I think you will find it's much more successful. And chromatic scale, we would start it out as I started with a 4, 3, 2, 1. And when we get to the next E flat, probably a good idea to do that with the 4, 3, 2, 1, because it helps to meld it together just a little bit better. I don't often use the 4, 3, 2, 1 in the chromatic scales, but in this particular case, I think it's a wise choice. Anybody have any complaints or criticisms?
No complaints or criticism, but when you were first talking about pedaling.
Yeah.
Pedaling on the second 16th.
Yes.
Do you then hold that first A? So
You don't need to. In the same way at the beginning, okay, I will, so at the beginning, you still hear the C a little bit, even though I was really off the pedal. Let's do it again. It doesn't sound so bad when I'm doing it that song. Now you get it. You still have that in it. Or if it was, like I said, if it were an X or maybe, no matter how carefully I play, it will always pick up the note before if you're playing legato. So, if you're playing legato, it will still hold the A. That will still be part of it. It will still work out.
I heard it, so that I have.
Good, good. Yes, yes, yes. If it always picks up, when you're playing legato, you put down the pedal, it will always pick up what's just before. Yes.
Brian, as a final tribute to Fur-Elise, can you tell them about the pianist who had the broken string?
Oh, yes, and then we should call it quits. So the high school teacher that I had, Conrad Wolf from the Peabody Institute, went over to Europe during World War II, and he was part of a group that was going to entertain troops. So he thought that he would play first Fur-Elise, since everybody knows that tune, and that would be a nice little thing for them to hear. But when he got to the piano, you can imagine the instruments weren't very good shape. This E was not working. So he thought, now what am I going to do? So he did. One other tiny little story. Does anyone here remember Mary Ferrari?
Yes.
Well, 100 years ago, I was at a bone shop recital at Hochstein School, and I sat down next to Mary. She was a lovely colleague and a friend, and we get the program started, and never identified who the teachers were of specific students in those days, at least. And so my student was about to play, and she looked over at me, not having a clue, and she said, "Oh, I can't imagine why any teacher would teach Fur-Elise to their student." I mean, my God, it's just... So the student did a very lovely job, and she had been wanting to do that, and I held a high standard for her very lovely that day. And Mary turned to me and said, "Wow, that was really very good." I said, "Thank you, Mary." Thank you all very much for listening to all my, oh, Beverly, yes.
No, I was
okay. And please, if anybody didn't get the free release for some reason would like to have it, I can certainly just email. Yeah, if you just let me, because I have this all in PDF, if you just email me, and then I'll know anybody who would.
Everybody got it.
Oh, everybody got it?
Yes.
Would you
Yeah.
maybe just send it to the guild email so that anyone who saw online could just,
Okay,
yeah?
sounds good.
So we are going to thank Brian again and give him another round of applause.
Thank you, you were a great audience. You listened very